Let's stay with the US protests. Here's Tom Nolan, who's a former Boston police officer and a former policy advisor at the Department of Homeland Security, also in Washington. Hi there, Tom. Thanks for being with us. I'll ask you the same question, good morning, as just put to our US correspondent in Washington also. What sort of night is expected across the US?
Well, I think we're looking at perhaps the sixth night now that we've seen widespread unrest and protests that have also accompanied instances of arson and destruction of property, vandalism, and throwing some projectiles and that kind of behavior at police. So I think this is going to continue unabated through the next several nights. We can expect that for sure.
Okay. Well, riot police are using tear gas, or have used tear gas and rubber bullets on previous nights. The National Guard is out on the streets. What do you make of the way these protests are being handled?
Well, we've seen an increase in the level of aggression and violence that the police have employed in attempting to quell the disturbances that have had questionable results thus far. And I think when you bring in the National Guard, and keep in mind, I don't know if you have an equivalent entity in Australia, but the National Guard are part-time soldiers that are employed by the various states in the United States, and they're typically inexperienced in dealing with situations in the streets of our cities, and they receive little, if any, training in dealing with civil disturbances. So adding that kind of presence to the mix can and has historically proven to be counterproductive. So you've got a situation where the police have escalated their strategies and their tactics, and it bears pointing out that in the United States we have over 18,000 state, local, and county police departments, different police departments, and the cities that are affected over the last several nights all have different approaches and different tactics and strategies that they employ. So there's no uniform set of appropriate responses other than the use of force and then the escalation of that force. And even the agencies that we've seen who are dealing with protesters in the streets have altered their tactics and their strategies from night to night. When something didn't work on Saturday, we're going to try something different on a Sunday night. So I think what we'll see is a continuation of an unfortunate result with this increased use of force when we dress police officers up like soldiers, and that's what we're doing for the public and people who are not participating in these protests, as well as people who are protesting. They oftentimes can't tell the difference between the police and the National Guard, who is the military. So it's a chaotic response. It's not a cohesive response. I don't see that the police have any kind of an end game plan here other than to just continue to ratchet up their use of force and their use of violence and weapons. And it should be pointed out, too, that the police are attacking the media as well. And it's not verbal assaults, that they are using the projectiles and the tear gas. They arrested a CNN camera crew broadcasting live on Friday morning. They arrested the on-air reporter, the cameraman, the producer, for reasons still unexplained. And we had an incident yesterday where an MSNBC reporter was shot in the leg with a rubber bullet. And members of the news media are reporting that they believe that the police are targeting them intentionally. And you mentioned earlier about some of the comments that are coming out of the White House that have demonized members of the media and given law enforcement a free rein to violate the First Amendment rights, not only of the protesters, but also of members of the media who have every right to be there reporting on these incidents.
We're looking at live pictures from New York of protesters gathering on the streets. Once again, Tom, previous to that, we saw scenes in Santa Monica in California. So these protests reaching from coast to coast. Minneapolis, of course, was the city where protests first began towards the end of last week, but Miami, Los Angeles, they're happening everywhere. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, you mentioned the White House, denies systemic racism in police forces in the US. You're a former police officer in Boston. What's your view on that?
I mean, that just ignores the reality of the history of racial animus, discrimination, and oppression that has characterized law enforcement in the United States since its inception in the middle part of the 19th century. So statements coming out of the White House denying that that systemic racism is a part of our criminal justice system, ignore the reality. And the cities that you mention, Sacramento, Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, Oakland, the cities, Minneapolis, certainly, these are cities that have historically had an abominable relationship between police officers and communities of color, and specifically African-American men and women and girls and boys as well. So, and the numbers speak to this issue. The police in the United States kill over 1,000 people a year, while the typical loss of life for police officers is about 50. The likelihood of an African-American man being killed by the police in the United States is 3.5 times higher than their white counterparts. So just to that statement like that is just a gratuitous manifestation of ignorance of what the reality is of policing in the United States in 2020, and that harkens back to, again, the early days of police agencies being set up.
Sadly, Tom, we've seen scenes like this on the streets of US cities before. Do you see these protests and these riots as being any different to those that have gone before them? Will this action be the one to change things?
The change has to come from police agencies and their willingness to resort to the use of violence and aggression in dealing with, in the situation we're talking about here, the man who was killed by police, Mr. Floyd, who was killed by police last Monday in Minneapolis, was suspected of a minor crime that, as far as I know, hasn't even been confirmed that it occurred. And we see repeatedly instances of the police going into marginalized communities, communities of color, and enforcing, hyper-enforcing low-level infractions like the one we saw last Monday that resulted in this gratuitous violence and the kneeling on this man's neck for almost 9 minutes, the last 3 minutes of which he had lost consciousness and was non-responsive. So until there is a sea change in the culture of policing, particularly the policing that goes on in communities of color in the United States, until that happens, we are going to continue to see protests like this, and sometimes violent protests. To go back to recently to 2014, in August of that year, in the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, people took to the streets immediately upon that young man's shooting death at the hands of then Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, and continued those protests through November. People thought then, and this is not even 6 years ago, that maybe this is the time we're going to turn things around. And here we are in 2020 in an arguably worse situation. So I'm not optimistic, and I'm certainly not heartened in any way by the increased level of aggression and violence that the police continue to employ night after night with no end game plan in sight. This is counterproductive. It's not going to come to a good result. And the last time I checked, the police haven't killed anybody else yet. But, I hope I'm wrong, but that may be only a matter of time before someone meets an unfortunate end at the hands of police.
Tom Nolan, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.